Tonight, while you're asleep, something is going to happen to your computer. Not a virus, not a hacker, not a power surge, something far more deliberate, far more calculated, and far more difficult to undo once it is done. At exactly 2 in the morning, if you have Windows 11 installed on your machine, Microsoft is going to push a mandatory system update that changes the rules of what you own, what you control, and what your computer is allowed to do without your permission. And the reason you have not heard about this from mainstream news, the reason your tech-savvy friends have not warned you, the reason Microsoft has not sent you a clear, plain language notification explaining exactly what is changing and why is not an accident. It is a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice made by a company that has spent the last several years quietly building the infrastructure for something that the technology industry calls a lockdown ecosystem, and that you should call what it actually is: the slow, systematic removal of your ability to use your own computer the way you want to use it. By the time this video is over, you are going to understand exactly what is happening tonight, why it is happening, what it means for your files, your software, your privacy, and your freedom to use your own machine. And I am going to give you a clear, specific action plan for what you can do right now before 2 in the morning to protect yourself, protect your data, and make an informed decision rather than waking up tomorrow to a computer that has already made decisions on your behalf. Let us start with a number: 1.4 billion. That is the number of active Windows devices in the world right now. 1.4 billion screens, 1.4 billion keyboards, 1.4 billion people who rely on Windows every single day for their work, their communication, their financial records, their creative projects, their memories stored in photos and documents and files that represent years of their lives. Windows is not just an operating system. For most of the world, Windows is the computer. When people sit down to work, they sit down to Windows. When small businesses run their operations, they run them on Windows. When students write papers and submit assignments and apply for jobs, they do it through Windows. The platform is so deeply embedded in the infrastructure of daily life that most people never stop to question it, never stop to think about the relationship between themselves and the company that made the software their entire digital life runs on. And that unquestioned trust is exactly what makes what is happening tonight so significant. Because the update Microsoft is pushing at 2 in the morning is not a security patch. It is not fixing a bug. It is not making your computer faster or your files safer. It is changing the fundamental architecture of what Windows is, what it does, and who it ultimately serves. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Microsoft has been building for the last 4 years. Because tonight's update is not an isolated event. It is the latest step in a strategic transformation that Microsoft began in earnest with the launch of Windows 11, and that has been accelerating ever since. Microsoft, like Google, like Apple, like every major technology company operating in the current economic environment, has been executing a deliberate pivot from a software company that sells you a product to a services company that sells access to a platform. The distinction sounds technical and abstract, but the consequences are enormous and they affect you directly. When you buy a product, you own it. When Microsoft sold you Windows 95, Windows XP, Windows 7, you paid a one-time fee and you owned that software. You could install it on your machine, use it indefinitely, modify it within the bounds of the license agreement, and Microsoft had no ongoing relationship with your computer once the transaction was complete. That model is over. Windows 11 is not a product you own. It is a service you are permitted to access, subject to terms and conditions that Microsoft can change, has changed, and will continue to change. Push silently to your device at 2 in the morning while you are asleep and cannot object. The update tonight activates 3 specific changes that Microsoft has been phasing in across the Windows 11 platform over the last 18 months. The first is the full enforcement of what Microsoft calls trusted platform module requirements at the system level. Your computer almost certainly already has a TPM chip. Microsoft required it as a condition of Windows 11 installation. But tonight's update moves TPM from a passive hardware component to an active gatekeeper. After this update, your machine will begin verifying the integrity of the boot process in a way that it did not before. And what that means in practice is that certain modifications to your system, certain third-party tools, certain configurations that you may have been using for years will be flagged, blocked, or reported back to Microsoft servers without any notification to you. The second change is the full rollout of Microsoft's AI companion system, which the company has branded under the Copilot framework across the core operating system layer. This is not an optional feature you can turn off in settings. After tonight's update, Copilot functionality is integrated at the system level, meaning it has access to your file system, your running processes, your clipboard contents, and your activity patterns in ways that a browser extension or an optional application simply does not. It is not sitting on top of Windows. It is woven into Windows. And the data it generates about your behavior on your own computer feeds back into Microsoft's cloud infrastructure by default. The third change, and this is the one that is generating the most concern among security researchers and privacy advocates, is the activation of a feature called Recall. If that name is familiar to you, it is because Microsoft announced Recall earlier this year to significant backlash, then said it would be optional, then said it would be delayed, then quietly began rolling it back out in phases. Tonight is the phase that affects your device. Recall works by taking continuous screenshots of everything you do on your computer, processing those screenshots with AI to create a searchable record of your entire activity history, and storing that record on your device. Microsoft says this data stays local. Microsoft says it is encrypted. Microsoft says you can delete it. But security researchers who have examined the actual implementation have found that the encryption is weaker than Microsoft described, that the database is accessible to any process running with user-level permissions, and that the data is comprehensive enough that anyone who gains access to it, whether through malware, through a legal process, or through a future Microsoft policy change, has a complete time-stamped record of every document you opened, every website you visited in any browser, every message you typed, every image you looked at, for as far back as the feature has been running. Now, Microsoft will tell you, and has told journalists and regulators, that these features are designed to make your computer more useful, more intelligent, and more secure. And in the narrowest technical sense, there's a version of that argument that is not entirely false. A computer that can remember everything you have done is, in a limited sense, a computer that can help you find things faster. A boot process that verifies its own integrity is, in a limited sense, more resistant to certain kinds of firmware attacks. But the question that Microsoft does not want you to ask, the question that the mainstream technology press has been remarkably slow to ask with the directness that the situation deserves, is more useful for whom? More secure for whom? Because the architecture of all three of these changes shares a common feature that is not incidental. It is the design. The data generated by your computer about your behavior on your computer flows upward to Microsoft's infrastructure. The verification processes of TPM enforcement give Microsoft, and theoretically other parties, insight into what software is running on your machine. The Recall database is a surveillance log of your digital life stored in a format that has already been demonstrated to be insecure. The beneficiary of all of this is not primarily you. The beneficiary is a company that, like Google, is in the middle of a massive strategic expansion into AI services, and that, like Google, needs data, behavioral data, activity data, the kind of data that tells you not just what people say they want, but what they actually do, what they actually read, what they actually type when no one is watching. Your computer's activity is now a data source, and tonight's update is the mechanism by which Microsoft has decided to begin harvesting it at scale. Let us talk about the legal and regulatory picture, because this context matters, and it is not being covered with the seriousness it deserves in most places. In March of this year, the European Union's data protection authorities opened formal investigations into Microsoft's Recall feature under the provisions of the General Data Protection Regulation. The core concern is straightforward. Continuous screenshot capture of user activity processed by AI and stored in a searchable database almost certainly constitutes processing of personal data at a scale and depth that requires explicit, informed consent under European law. Microsoft has not obtained that consent. It has buried disclosure of Recall in its terms of service update documentation, in the kind of language that the company knows no ordinary person reads. In the United Kingdom, the Information Commissioner's Office sent Microsoft a formal information request about Recall, demanding detailed answers about data retention, data security, and the basis on which Microsoft claims legal authority to process this data. In the United States, senators from both parties have written letters to Microsoft's chief executive demanding answers about Recall's data security architecture, following the security researchers' demonstration that the Recall database could be exfiltrated by malware in under 10 seconds. None of these investigations have concluded. None of them have resulted in orders that would stop tonight's update. Regulatory processes move slowly. They will take months or years to produce outcomes. And in the meantime, at 2 a.m. tonight, the update runs. Here is what this means for specific categories of people, and I want you to think about which of these categories apply to you or to someone you care about. If you are a professional who works with confidential client information, attorneys, therapists, accountants, medical professionals, financial advisors, the Recall database running on your Windows 11 machine is creating a continuous record of your client interactions, your document contents, your communications. The confidentiality obligations you have to your clients exist in law. The security architecture of Recall, as documented by independent researchers, does not meet the standard that those legal obligations require. If you are a journalist, a researcher, a whistleblower, or anyone whose safety depends on the confidentiality of their sources or their communications, a continuously running screenshot system that logs everything on your machine represents a threat model that you cannot afford to ignore. If you are a parent who uses your computer for anything you would not want your children to eventually be able to access, or if you share a machine with other people in your household, the recall database is a comprehensive log of everything done on that computer by everyone who uses it. If you are an ordinary person who simply believes that what you do on your own computer, in your own home, on hardware you paid for, should not be recorded in a searchable database accessible to a corporation, then what is happening tonight is a direct challenge to something that used to be a reasonable expectation and is now being taken away quietly at 2 a.m. while you sleep. So what do? This is where we stop describing the problem and start solving it, because there are specific actionable things you can do right now, tonight, before the update runs. And in the days following, that will meaningfully protect your data and restore a measure of control over your own machine. The first thing you need to do right now is delay the update. Open your Windows settings. Go to Windows Update, find the option labeled Pause Updates and set it to pause for the maximum available duration, which on most Windows 11 configurations is 5 weeks. This does not permanently block the update, but it buys you time. Time to make informed decisions, time to back up your data, time to implement the protective measures described below before the new system architecture is in place. Do this right now before you do anything else. The second thing you need to do is back up everything, not a partial backup. A complete system image backup of your entire machine as it currently exists. Windows has a built-in backup tool, but for this purpose, you want something more comprehensive. A tool like Macrium Reflect, which is free for personal use, will create a complete byte-for-byte image of your entire system that you can restore from in the event that tonight's update or a future update causes problems you cannot resolve. Store this backup on an external drive that you then disconnect from your machine. An external drive that remains connected to a computer running recall is a drive whose contents are being logged. Disconnect it. Store it somewhere physically separate. This backup is your insurance policy and it costs you nothing but time. The third thing you need to understand is how to disable recall after the update does eventually install. Microsoft has made this more difficult than it should be, but it is possible. After the update installs, go to Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Recall and Snapshots. There's a toggle to turn off the snapshot saving feature. Turn it off. Then go to the Storage Sense settings and delete the existing recall database. Be aware that some security researchers have noted that the recall service continues to run in the background, even after the toggle is set to off, though it should not be saving new snapshots. For users who want to go further, there is a community-maintained tool called Recall Remover that disables the underlying recall service at the system level, rather than simply through the settings toggle. It is available on GitHub and has been reviewed by multiple independent security researchers. The fourth step, and this one matters enormously, is to audit your privacy settings at the Microsoft account level. Go to account.microsoft.com, sign in, and navigate to the privacy section. There's a category called Activity History. Turn off all Activity History collection. There is a section for diagnostic data. Set it to required only, not full. There's a section for personalized ads. Turn it off. These settings do not undo what Recall does locally on your device, but they limit how much of your activity Microsoft aggregates at the account level and uses for its own purposes. The fifth step is to consider your browser situation on Windows specifically. Microsoft Edge, which Windows 11 sets as the default browser, and which Windows 11 actively works to restore as your default even after you have changed it, is deeply integrated with Microsoft's data collection infrastructure. Edge has its own tracking systems, its own behavioral data collection, and its own connection to Microsoft's advertising ecosystem. If you are using Edge on Windows 11, you are feeding data into 2 parallel collection systems simultaneously. Chrome, as we have discussed in detail elsewhere, feeds data to Google's system. The meaningful alternatives here are Firefox and Brave, for exactly the reasons described previously, and setting them as your default browser is a step that meaningfully reduces your data exposure even within the Windows 11 environment. Now, I want to address the question that some of you are already thinking. Is this really as serious as it sounds, or is this tech alarmism? And I want to answer that honestly because that question deserves a direct answer. Not everything described as a privacy threat is equally serious. Technology journalism has a well-documented tendency towards sensationalism. So let me be precise about what is established fact and what is genuine interpretation. It is established fact, documented in Microsoft's own release notes, that tonight's update activates recall on Windows 11 devices. It is established fact, demonstrated by independent security researchers, including researchers at cybersecurity firms with no financial interest in the outcome, that the recall database has security, vulnerabilities that Microsoft's own description of the feature did not acknowledge. It is established fact that European regulators have opened formal investigations into recall under data protection law. It is established fact that Microsoft moved recall from an announced optional feature to a default-on feature after initial backlash, with a level of transparency that multiple technology journalists have criticized as inadequate. What is interpretation is the question of intent. Whether Microsoft is acting with deliberate disregard for user privacy, or whether these are the mistakes of a large organization moving fast in a competitive AI landscape, is a question reasonable people can disagree about. What is not a matter of interpretation is the practical consequence. A continuously running screenshot system with documented security vulnerabilities is running on your machine by default starting tonight, unless you take action to stop it. The broader point, the one worth sitting with after you have taken all the practical steps described above, is this. The relationship between users and the operating systems they depend on is changing in ways that have no historical precedent, and that most people have not consciously consented to because they have never been asked. For 40 years, a personal computer was personal. What happened on it was yours. The files you created were yours. The activity you conducted was yours. That assumption is being replaced not through a dramatic announcement, not through a policy debate that the public was invited into, but through a settings page buried in a system update pushed at 2 a.m. to 1.4 billion devices simultaneously. You paid for your computer. You pay for your internet connection. You pay, in some cases, for a Microsoft 365 subscription on top of that. You are a paying customer of this platform. And paying customers deserve to know, in plain language, before the fact, not buried in update documentation, what changes are being made to the machine they paid for and why. Tonight's update is a reminder that, in the current technology landscape, buying a device does not mean owning what runs on it. The software layer, the one that sits between you and everything your machine can do, is controlled by a company whose interests are not identical to yours and whose ability to change. The terms of that relationship without your explicit consent is right now largely unlimited. That is the situation, and awareness of it is the beginning of doing something about it. Pause the update. Back up your system. Disable recall. Audit your account settings. Change your browser. Take 30 minutes tonight. Because at 2 a.m, the window closes and the decisions get made for you.